Good evening. It's always good to be able to come here and to participate in worshiping with everyone here at Asheville Road and to be able to see family as always. You know, oftentimes whenever whenever I hear people ask the question, what is something that you want to work on in your Christianity? What is something that you feel like needs improvement? A lot of times I feel like the answer ends up being prayer. I'd really like to work on my prayer, or I really want to be more consistent in my prayer. I really want to have a better depth in my prayers. So I figured a good topic for tonight would be to discuss strengthening our prayer life. Now, I need to kind of caveat this for just a second because it's not going to be a comprehensive study on prayer. There's no way that you guys would be patient enough to sit here for a discussion like that. That would take a while. This is also not necessarily going to cover everything I would like to discuss about prayer, because even there's a lot to discuss. Instead, what I figure we do is we would go to Matthew chapter 6, where Jesus talks about prayer in the Sermon on the Mount, and we would look at what Jesus has to say there. And that will kind of be where we start and also end the discussion, so that there are bounds on what I can talk about and I don't keep you here for too long. So we'll do that in Matthew chapter 6. And to set the context for this, Jesus is preaching the Sermon on the Mount, which I'm sure is a sermon a lot of us are familiar with, but really the crux to the Sermon on the Mount is this, where Jesus says, "Unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven." Which is a really bold statement to make, because if you're a Jew at that time listening to Jesus talk, the righteousness of the Pharisees and of the scribes is really kind of the pinnacle that everyone looked up to, like, oh, I want to be like those people. And Jesus is saying, well, that's really not enough. Well, how is it not enough? You see, their actions may be, for the most part, what they need to be, but the point Jesus got at in the Sermon on the Mount is it's not just your actions, but where your heart is as well. And so he goes into all these different aspects of our life that we need to work on, and one of those being prayer. So he says this, "And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard by their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask Him. Pray then like this: Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." In these verses, there's quite a bit to unpack here that Jesus delivers to His audience. The first one is this: my prayer needs to be sincere. Which, whenever I say it like that, and as I was building this point, I thought to myself, well, that seems kind of obvious, does it not? If I'm going to pray, it needs to be a sincere prayer. Yet if it was intuitively obvious, Jesus wouldn't have said it. Because unfortunately, sometimes that's not the way we approach prayer. And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and in the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. Jesus immediately starts off in discussing prayer by saying, hey, when you pray, you need to pray with a sincere heart, and we're going to use this as an example. These hypocrites over here, these people who stand up and they pray these great prayers. And for a long time, as I heard people talking about this, and I imagine this in my mind, for some reason I always thought of public prayer. And I always thought of, people who get up like here on a Sunday morning and lead a prayer in front of the entire congregation. And that's what I had in my mind. But the more I've studied this text, the more I've come to realize Jesus isn't discussing a public prayer in this context. He's discussing a private prayer. Let me not get tongue-tied around that. A private prayer in a public setting. Right? Someone who takes a prayer that really and truly ought to be just between them and God, and then starts praying it for everyone else to hear. Notice what he says here, that they may be seen by others. The purpose of this prayer is not to be heard by God. The purpose of this prayer is to be heard by the people around me. Well, why would you do that? I don't know. Maybe you want to seem holy. Maybe you want to have people appreciate what you've done. Maybe you end up comparing yourself to someone else. There are those out there who pray for the sake of being heard by others, whether it's to receive admiration, to look holy. And I say here to preach at others. What I mean by that is I'm talking down at you. Hey, you do this and you do that. Unfortunately, I have heard that sometimes in some public prayers, which is sad. But that approach as well, like, hey, let me talk about how good I am when you're struggling with something that I'm not struggling with. And by the way, all of this lesson and all of what Jesus said here is geared around the private prayers that we have with our God. But all of this can be applied to prayers in a public setting, or what we might also refer to as corporate prayers, prayers in a congregational setting where somebody gets up and leads all of us together before God. Well, there are some reasons here, though, that people have for not praying to God, which seems weird when you think about it, but it happens. Jesus told this parable in Luke chapter 18. The Pharisee standing by himself prayed thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give tithes of all that I get. What's interesting to me to kind of take this prayer out of its context for just a minute in comparison to the tax collector and just look at it on its own as you have a Pharisee standing by himself. Who else is listening? I mean, maybe the tax collector in this instance hears him, and man, what a gut punch that would be to be the tax collector. Hey, God, I'm so glad I'm not like that guy. I mean, what's he doing here? He's comparing himself to other people. Right? He's using this as an opportunity to make himself feel better about him. He's using this as an opportunity to remind himself of how great he is in his own eyes. Right? These are the type of prayers that Jesus is talking about here in Matthew chapter 6 when he talks about praying with sincerity. Notice, and I think I've already alluded to this, but Jesus is not condemning public prayer in this passage. Rather, he's challenging my approach to prayer. Why am I praying? Right? Why am I saying anything at all? What's my motivation for this prayer? Is it to parade myself in front of others? Is it to put someone else down because I don't like what they're doing? Or is it to actually come before my God and empty my heart to Him? Then Jesus says, but when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Now, this is another one of those that growing up I had thought a lot about. Okay, does that mean I need to go into my room every time I say a private prayer? I don't necessarily think that's where Jesus is getting at here. I think he's going to an extreme to prove a point. If you isolate yourself from everybody else, if you isolate yourself from everything else going on in this world, and all that exists is just you and God, what are you going to say? How are you going to approach Him? Right? That's where the true test of sincerity comes in. When you are forced to be in a situation where it's just you and God, now what? When your Father who sees you in secret, what is He going to think about it? The object of prayer is to be noticed and heard by the only one who can answer my prayers. Right? If the point of me praying is for other people to notice that, hey, I'm a good person because I pray to God, or to notice that I'm just a good person because look at all the great things that I do, can those people do anything about my prayers? Can those people change my life in the way that God can? Can those people listen to the needs that I bring before my God, or listen to the thanksgiving that I bring before my God and do anything about it? The object of prayer, and like I said, it's one of those things though that you read and you're like, well, no duh, Marcus. But the object of prayer is to be noticed and heard by the one who can answer it. Even in a public setting. Right? It's not about the person up here praying to deliver some, awesome message to everyone out here. It's about our collective thoughts being brought before God. The only one who can answer them. But it also, and this is another way of thinking about it, to direct my prayers to God, I need an existing relationship with God. That's kind of the other aspect of this that comes out of this text at me. That if I'm going to be sincere in my prayer to God, if I'm going to approach my God, then I have to have some sort of relationship with Him going into it. Which once again, when you stop and think about it for a minute, it makes sense. But to me, this is one of those things that the more I think about it, the more I realize that, hey, when my prayer life is struggling, it's probably because my relationship with God is struggling. I want us to notice how Jesus makes, how Jesus explains this, or puts this into practice, I should say. Sorry. How Jesus puts this into practice in that model prayer that He then gives. He says, and pray like this, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. That word hallowed, it's kind of an old English word. Maybe a better way for us to say it would be this. Our Father in heaven, let your name be kept holy. Or another way of saying it is, let your name be held in reverence. That's an interesting way to start a prayer. What's He doing here? Jesus began His prayer by directing His attention to His Father and acknowledging the greatness of His power and His name. Right? And this goes back to that previous relationship with God. Who is God to me? How do I view God? How do I see God? And this is the frame in which Jesus starts His prayer. Father, let your name be kept holy. You are awesome. You are great. You are powerful. He is my Savior. He is my King. He is my Father. He is my sustainer. There's a lot of different aspects to my relationship with God that frame how I approach Him. And then He keeps going. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Now this one's a a bit of a doozy to think about. So, for a long time, I thought that Your Kingdom Come was talking about the church coming. I don't necessarily hold that view anymore. I see this more poetic, and bear with me, the key to this being Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Maybe another way of saying this is this way. God may be my Father, but He is also my King, and I should honor His will with the same resolve and respect as the angelic beings in heaven do. So think about this for just a second. When God, and you see this at different points in the Bible whenever we get these pictures, these glimpses of God in heaven, the relationship between God and all the angelic hosts that are in heaven, this reverence for Him, this obedience to His will, and God, or Jesus rather, here says, it's my job to have that same attitude here on earth. You want to talk about a sucker punch to the gut? That's one of those that the more I think about it, the more it hurts. Because is that my attitude towards God's will? Is that my attitude towards God? Do I see Him in the light of, hey, what He needs done, I'm going to be doing? Do I show Him the same respect as those seraphim say that surround His throne? And so what Jesus does here in the first couple lines of His prayer is He approaches God in sincerity based on this relationship that He has with Him. And He recognizes and then humbles Himself before God. He humbles Himself before His Father and says, this is where I'm at, this is where you're at. This is who I am, and this is who you are. To me, when I think about sincerity in prayer, that's a great example of it. That's what it means to lean into your relationship with God. So then we kind of come to the next section there that Jesus has, that He says to the people listening to Him. And before I get to this next point, I want to preface this. So this whole sermon actually started many, many years ago. When I was in high school, I was visiting the campus of Freed Hardeman, and I don't remember what it was for. But when I was hanging out in the dorms, one of the guys there brought up this passage in Matthew chapter 6 to me, and especially the part where it says that the Father already knows what you need before you ask. And he asked me this question, well, Marcus, then why do we need to pray? And that really caught me off guard because I really didn't have a good answer for him. And that's something I had thought about for years afterwards, just thought about his question. But then it led me to this point right here. God does not need my prayers. In fact, I'd argue God doesn't need anything because He is self-sufficient. He sustains Himself. But God doesn't need my prayers. He doesn't need me to tell Him what I need because He already knows. But maybe that's not the best way to frame this point because, that just seems a little odd. So how about we say this instead? Prayer is for my benefit, not for God's. How about that? Which is a little weird at first, but bear with me through this. Prayer is for my benefit, not for God's. And when you pray, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. This actually happens, and I find myself doing this more than I'd like to admit. And I really like the way this is phrased in the English Standard, empty phrases. Some of your translations will say vain repetitions. It's this idea right here. I'm saying something without meaning it. which is really scary when you think about that, because how many of us really want to be talking with someone and not know what we're saying, or not really be thinking about what we're saying? And that's what Jesus is calling out here. You have these Gentiles who would have these elaborate prayers, and they were almost like rituals that they would get up and proclaim in front of their gods. Actually, I think a really good modern-day example of this would be the rosary beads. Right? And you're going through and you're saying the same thing as you're flipping through the beads. It's ritualistic. But are you actually thinking about what you're saying? And unfortunately, sometimes we get ourselves into trouble, saying in a public prayer setting where we tend to do this sometimes as well. Sometimes we use fancy words or phrases that we've heard other people say in their prayers that maybe we think make us sound more holy or official or knowledgeable. There's a guy that we used to give a hard time because we had talked to him about this, but he kept doing it. And so finally, me and a couple of my friends, we gave up. And so every time he would get up to lead a prayer and say this dictionary word that none of us knew, we'd come up to him afterwards and say, "You know what that means? Because I didn't." And he'd sit there, well, and try to make up a definition for it. Why do that? I assume his was to make himself feel more knowledgeable. But what are you really getting out of that? Right? If prayer is for my benefit, not for God's, who's getting something out of that? Is anyone getting anything out of that? Go back to this one for just a second, because I thought this is funny, but ironically, people today quote the model prayer. They quote this prayer that Jesus gives, which in and of itself isn't a bad thing, but they do it without understanding its meaning or without thinking about it. Right? I've heard people just quote this verbatim, and I don't think they realized what they were talking about or what they were truly asking for or truly saying, which defeats the whole purpose, because this is the very thing that Jesus is trying to teach us not to do. This is the very thing that He's saying, hey, don't do this. The Gentiles do it, don't you do it too? Don't be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask Him. So where does that lead us thinking about that? You won't tell God something in your prayers that He doesn't already know. He knows if you're about to bring a prayer of thanksgiving before Him with a lot of joy in your heart. And He knows you're thankful already. He knows when you're about to bring a bunch of cares and worries before Him. He already knows that, so why say anything at all? Because when I pray, I am reminding myself of what I need to bring before God. Think about it this way. As a parent, for the parents in the room, have you ever had that moment where, one of your kids comes up to you and either they want something or maybe they're in trouble, and rather than beat them to the punch, you let them ask you first, or you let them tell you what they did wrong first, even though you already know. Why'd you do that? Right? You do it for their benefit. You do it because you know they need to hear it. Either they need to express what they're wanting to you in that moment, or they need to be willing to admit a fault or a guilt to the situation. It's the same way with our prayers with God. Yes, He already knows. So why do it at all? Because I need to hear it. I need to be reminded. I need to stop and think for a second about what are the cares and the needs that I want to bring before God, or I should be bringing before God. What is it that I'm truly thankful for, that I want to express to God my thanks? God does not need your prayers, but He does want them. Right? And I was a little nervous when I was putting this together because I was, thinking in my head, well, I hope someone doesn't take this the wrong way and go, oh, well, Marcus is saying that we might as well not pray. That's not true. God may not need them, but He wants to hear them. Partially because He wants us to realize what we depend on Him for. He wants us to realize that we need Him. He wants us to remind ourselves of our relationship with Him, but also because He wants to hear from us. Because He loves you and He cares about you. He wants you to come before Him. Think about the passage in Romans chapter 8 where Paul said, likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weaknesses. For we do not know what to pray for as we ought. But the Spirit Himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. God wants to hear from you so badly that the Holy Spirit works as this intermediary between you and God so that He can put what's going on in your heart into words you don't even know how to express. Into ideas and concepts you're not even ready to bring before God. He wants that relationship with you. He wants your prayers. No, He doesn't need them, but He wants them. He wants to hear from you. We'll go back now to this concept that Jesus puts forward. He doesn't have a problem with rehearsing or repeating a prayer, right? Don't take that away from this passage. It's doing it devoid of thought or intent. In fact, if you think about it, even Jesus Himself repeats a prayer. When He's in when He's in the last night before His crucifixion, right? On the Mount of Olives, what is He doing up there with His disciples? He's praying. And we read this in Matthew chapter 26. Again, for the second time, He went away and prayed, my Father, this cannot pass unless I drink it. Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. And then He goes back to His disciples, and He sees them, they're drowsy, so they're falling asleep. So then He goes back, leaving them again. He went away and prayed for a third time, saying the same words again. Right? Jesus is just praying this prayer over and over. Father, I don't want to do this. And why would He? The death on a cross is miserable. It's awful. And everything leading up to it was pretty brutal as well. I really don't want to do this. But your will also be done. I don't want to, but I'm going to. Right? And Jesus repeats this over and over. The repetition isn't the issue. All right? That's not the issue Jesus has with prayer. It's not having intent behind it. It's not meaning the words that you're saying. It's not having emotion and thought in what you're bringing before Him. We also see this in Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 8. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the people. So just to give you a little context, Nehemiah is coming before the king of Persia. He's really wanting to quit his job so he can go to Jerusalem and help them rebuild the city. And so before he goes and says, hey, can I leave? He's praying to God first and building up his courage to go do this. Right? And I've heard people say in the past, well, don't bother praying and quoting Scripture in your prayers, or don't bother praying about God's promises because, well, He already knows. He already knows the rest anyways as well. Now look what Nehemiah just did. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses. Well, of course God remembers. He was there. He was the one who said it. If you're unfaithful, I'm kicking you out. Nehemiah wasn't reminding God of His promise. He was reminding himself of why they had left Jerusalem. All right, in his prayer to God, I recognize that the reason why this has all happened is because we messed up. We made mistakes. But then he goes on in the prayer, but what I'm asking is I want to be part of the solution. I want to be part of the remnant that comes back, because later on in his prayer he also mentions where God said, and if you're faithful, I'll bring you back. And I want to be part of that. The content of my prayer is the result of how well I understand God and what I need to say to Him at the time. All right, that's kind of the conclusion we can draw from this point right here. The content of my prayers, how deep my prayers get, what am I going to say, how am I going to approach God? Well, all that is going to depend on how well you understand Him, how well you understand how He works, and whatever it is you want to bring before Him at the time. Which once again comes back to the fact that we've got to have a relationship with God to begin with, and also the better our understanding of God, the deeper our prayers are going to be. And for that, I keep thinking back to Jesus' prayer in the garden where He says, I really don't want to do this, but your will be done. That takes a lot of maturity and a very good relationship with God to say, there's a lot of me that doesn't want to go through with this, but I will go through with it anyways. And to acknowledge that to the Father. It's kind of restating what I just said, so we'll skip that. So let's see how this plays out in Jesus' prayer. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. So now as we carry on in this model prayer, Jesus is going to bring this forward, right? That how well I understand how God works and also what is needed at the time is now going to frame the rest of this. Starting with this phrase, give us this day our daily bread. Right? This idea of daily bread is a reminder of our dependency on God. Right? I depend on God for what it is that I need. I depend on Him to take care of me. And in fact, if you go just a little bit further on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus then dives into this a little bit more, where He talks about not worrying about tomorrow. Tomorrow's going to work itself out. Tomorrow, let it worry about itself. You focus on today. Right? And He's doing the same thing here in His prayer. He's focusing on the here and now. He's focusing on that particular day. Give us this day our daily bread. God, let me make sure I'm focused on what is going on and I am the best that I can be and I'm doing what I need to do. Let me make sure I'm taking care of what I can take care of right here and right now. Once again, there's a lot of spiritual maturity that comes out at you when you read this from Jesus. And then He says, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. It sounds like a really good lesson that we could maybe do on forgiveness. Wow, that was sad. Huh? I thought maybe I'd get a chuckle or two. So here's this. I cannot refuse to forgive others who have wronged me if I'm going to ask God for His forgiveness. All right, this is kind of yet another bit of a sucker punch to the gut here. Think about what Jesus is saying here. He's essentially saying, God, if I haven't forgiven other people, don't forgive me. Now, this is not saying Jesus needed forgiveness for any sins He committed, but for everyone else. Imagine having the courage to say that to God, even though it ought to be our approach. If I'm unwilling to forgive those who have wronged me, or in the way that Jesus says it here, refers to as a debt, then don't do that for me. I don't deserve it. All right, once again, there's a reminder to myself of my obligation. There's a reminder to myself of where I need to be as I approach God. I want to be forgiven, but God, not if I'm unwilling to forgive others. And He says, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. So right here, Jesus isn't implying rather that God leads us into temptation. I think James chapter 1 and verse 13 makes that very clear, where it says there that God does not tempt any man. But rather, what I think he's saying here is this is a reminder of God's promise to me that He'll provide a way for me to escape sin when temptation presents itself. That I will have a way of escape. Right? And Paul, talks about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. But this is an example of that being put into practice. Right? Is Jesus acknowledging that hey, lead us from evil. God, this is what you do. This is who you are. I need to be reminded that I can look to you, that you're going to make sure that there is a way that I can walk away or say no or stop for a moment before I've gone too far. And we need that reminder. I would also add that in here, so some of your translations may say, deliver us from the evil one. And that's because there is a definite article there in the Greek, so there's a lot of people who think this is referring to Satan himself. I don't necessarily know that I hold that. I really don't think it matters all that much. I just tend to take the more generic view that this is just talking about evil in general. This is talking about temptation in general. That there will be different things in this life that trip us up. And some of these things I bring on myself. Some of these things I put in front of myself, which isn't great. But I know I can depend on God to help me get out of it. So Jesus began His prayer by acknowledging His relationship with God, by humbling Himself before God, and then He finishes His prayer by petitioning God in a way that was consistent with how God works, and also based on what was most important to Him and to the other people around Him at that time. All right, so he tells us, this is how you should pray. And then turns around and shows us that in a prayer. Shows us that in action. And the more I've studied this and the more I've thought about it, the more I've come to this conclusion right here. And this is my opinion. Maybe you don't necessarily agree with me, but that's okay. Prayer is the pinnacle of our relationship with God. And some of you may take a little bit of issue with that. That is okay. But in my experience, the conclusion I've come to is prayer is the pinnacle of our relationship with God. It's not the foundation. It's not how I start a relationship with God. It's what I get when I have a relationship with God. Which makes sense if you think about it. There are some of you in this room that I know better than others. We're going to have deeper conversations. There are some of you in this room that I'm more of an acquaintance with. We're not going to have the same level of conversations with each other. Right? So it's this pinnacle of our relationship with God. However, that means my prayer will only be as strong as my relationship with Him. I think if you really wanted to do a comprehensive study of prayer, it probably wouldn't even begin at prayer. Right? It would really need to start here with the relationship. Because if you can't get this right, the prayer's not going to come easy. But conversely, and this is something I've thought about, because it's easy to say this, right? It's easy to say, oh, well, you can make your prayer better by just have a better relationship with God. The problem is when you realize that your prayer life isn't where you want it to be. Right? If I'm honest with myself, my prayer life isn't where I want it to be. What does that mean? It means I don't have the relationship with God that I need to have. It means I have got some work I need to do. It means I still have a ways to go, especially when I think to myself that I had a better prayer life a couple years ago than I do today. Which means my relationship's going in the wrong direction than I want it to. So I want to close by asking just a couple of questions here for all of us to think about. The first one is this. What am I doing to strengthen my relationship with God? If prayer is truly built on this foundation of my relationship with God, then if I want to have a better prayer life, I've got to have a better relationship. I know what I need to work on. I don't necessarily know what you need to work on, but I hope you do know what you need to work on. So my challenge to you is this. What can I do to strengthen that relationship with Him? And by the way, I'll just throw this out here. It's not going to happen overnight. That's one of my pet peeves when preachers get up and they talk about something and it's almost as if, oh yeah, you can change this overnight. No, you can't. It'll be a process. But it's one you should at least start tonight. Next is this. When I pray, what is my motivation for praying? All right, where's my sincerity? What am I trying to achieve through my prayer? Am I speaking or am I seeking to come before God and empty my heart out to Him, whether it's in thanksgiving, whether it's in sorrow? Or do I tell God what I think He wants to hear, or do I even tell God what I think other people should hear? When I'm actually praying, what am I saying? And what do I mean behind it? So if you're here this evening and you're not yet a child of God, a way to work on your prayer life is to start by having a relationship with Him. And we can help you with that, certainly. But if you're here tonight and you're already a child of God, perhaps your prayer life isn't where it needs to be. Please ask yourself these questions, and we will help you. We will more than willing to pray with you and pray for you, yes, publicly together, but also privately, to help encourage you in the process, to help you become a better Christian, and therefore stronger in your prayer. If you have a need like that we can help you with, if you just let us know as we stand and as we sing.